Well, thanks, Neville, and thanks to the Texas A&M team and your partners for the work on the small-scale irrigation innovation lab, as well as your other contributions, for example, to the World Bank meeting this week. Certainly, irrigation is a core component of our work in sustainable intensification. Now, you may wonder why I put up center pivot irrigation, a picture of center pivot irrigation systems. But on a personal note, I grew up in eastern Colorado over the Ogallala Aquifer. My folks live right there. So I come from a heavily irrigated area, and one that in which irrigation has transformed agriculture over the past 40 years even. So, one of my perspectives of irrigation is large scale, capital intensive, very competitive, and requiring frequent access to inputs, crop varieties, and so on. So that's quite a different perspective than the perspective needed, I believe, as we look at smallholder irrigation strategies in complex landscapes, challenging landscapes, landscapes where the soil is not nearly so fertile as where I come from. So it's been a real eye-opener. And today I just want to kind of talk about some of my personal high-level insights that came from a recent trip in Ethiopia to sites involving the Small-Scale Irrigation Innovation Lab, as well as one of our other projects, Africa Rising. So to try and avoid some of the repetition from the World Bank event, I thought I'd just go through some narratives of what we saw on this multi-location tour in Ethiopia. But first, just to define what we mean by sustainable intensification, it's fairly simple. We're essentially looking at increasing productivity, but also with consideration of the social, economic, and environmental impacts. And looking at it through a livelihoods lens, what are the impacts on the households? Essentially, producing more with more efficient use of inputs, and to avoid those negative environmental impacts, and to hit those objectives that Rob pointed out on food security, nutrition, and resilience. Now, one of our organizing concepts around sustainable intensification is the integration of socioeconomic factors with improved genetics, both in crops and livestock, and then ecological approaches to using water and natural resources much more effective. Combining those in research programs to deliver on multiple objectives through a systems approach. And of course, even in this image, irrigation and access to water and the management of the flow of water across that landscape is quite evident. We have several projects within our program in sustainable intensification. And of course, the Small Scale Irrigation Innovation Lab is one, but we also do a lot of work on integrated pest management, soil fertility, and systems work led by the CG system in Africa Rising and led by U.S. universities in the case of the Sustainable Intensification Innovation Lab led by Kansas State University. So kind of a range of projects that we like to integrate the outcomes from to get the biggest bang for our buck. Just some of the insights that I took away from this recent tour of Ethiopian landscapes is that integrated watershed management really provides some opportunities to expand and diversify irrigation systems. And I'll give some examples of that. The other thing, and Rob touched on this, is the livestock revolution, expecting to double production of livestock and demand for livestock products over the next 2 to 3 decades. A lot of that has to come from existing cropland. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily more animals, but certainly greater productivity of the existing animals. And we're seeing that in areas where people are managing water better and utilizing irrigation. And then diversification of some of the agricultural systems, but also diversification of the irrigation systems. And what we see is, unlike where I came from, where there was really primarily one irrigation system used by nearly everyone in the area, what we're seeing is single households using multiple irrigation strategies, not just one. So just to give you the context of what we were looking at, this is a landscape profile of just one landscape in northern Ethiopia in the Tigray region. And Africa Rising was leading a integrated watershed project looking at helping the Ethiopian government manage the way water flowed through the landscape, was stored for use, and then distributed across that landscape. Embedded within that research is work on improved crop varieties, agronomic practices, including soil fertility, introduction of improved and alternative livestock feeds, introduction of higher value crops, and of course irrigation strategies. The outcomes from the small-scale irrigation innovation lab feed right into this larger project. And then outcomes from that larger project feed back into the irrigation innovation lab. But as you can see, different approaches are needed at different elevations to manage that water flow. And that takes quite complex engineering. One of the important factors is what a farmer does down here alone in isolation isn't very effective if you're not also managing what's going on these upper slopes. In fact, it really hinges on cooperative community effort to get this water flow right. And really, of course, tied to that water flow is the flow of soil, which you want to stop. But there's a lot of opportunities that emerge from this integrated watershed management approach. Here's an image of that, of a similar landscape. And so there's a lot of activities at all elevations here, but as you can see, quite different activities. So you need different research activities all along that profile. Now this is a research landscape, and the programs have similar landscapes, but not under research. And what they're finding is that within as short as 3 years, they see profound positive benefits from managing that water flow through reforestation, check dams, reservoirs, a whole range of water management practices. Now that includes larger scale irrigation projects. For example, here's a reservoir, a well that's collecting water from upslope and is being distributed to a lot of farmers downslope. So this includes quite a number of households relying on the water that's collected and then redistributed from here. You can see a little ditch going down from there. So that's fairly large-scale collection of water, storage, and then distribution. But within that system, there's also a lot of opportunity for micro-enterprises at the household level even. That's, I think, increasingly of interest to youth. Young men and women that can invest a modest amount of money and start their own business. For example, here, this young family owns a pump. They go around, take that collected water from maybe a ditch or stream and redistribute it for a fee to specific households. Now, this is a fellow with a 3-year-old avocado tree. I don't know if you can see, but it was massive production from this one very young tree within 3 years. And to ensure that his investments in these improved varieties of avocados was worthwhile, he also invested in irrigation. At first, it was just basically distributing it by hand from buckets. But as he expanded into horticultural crops and expanded the irrigation on his across his farm, it was a self-reinforcing system. So to ensure his initial investments in the crops, he needed irrigation. Well, that increased his revenues that he was able to reinvest in now solar-powered pump that eliminated the drudgery of hand watering, allowing him to further expand. So it was the knock-on benefits of adding irrigation to his system. Now, as Rob pointed out, and I mentioned earlier, one thing that really stuck out in this trip in Ethiopia, the ones that we've done in West Africa, well, across sub-Saharan Africa, is just the incredible rise in demand for livestock feed. And as I mentioned, much of that is being drawn from croplands, so increased use of crop residues, which can be very detrimental to soil resources, leading to declines in yields. So farmers are very keen to invest more in improved forages, increasing the productivity of their staple food crops so that they can get more residues with less damage, but also improving the efficiency of feeding. Very simple, improved feeding trough that saved 50% of the forage being fed to the livestock. That incentivizes greater investment in better livestock, but also in strategies to improve the production of fodders, irrigated fodder. We saw it widespread throughout those areas where they had invested in the improvements to the watershed. So again, linking this back to the watershed, you get this self-reinforcement. What makes these investments worthwhile is the farmer being placed in a watershed where water across that landscape is being better managed. What makes that investment to the government and the community in improving the watershed management is the increased productivity, increased income, increased livelihoods of these individual farmers within that landscape. And again, that's self-reinforcing. So here's one of the innovations to manage water flow across that landscape, a very simple soil ridge to stop the flow, but on that soil ridge growing improved forage varieties, and that's tree lucerne, an increasingly important source of livestock feed with improved management, improved soil conservation, and so on. So these are sort of self-reinforcing activities that farmers are more willing to invest in once their productivity goes up and they see the benefits of not just managing the water but also producing more livestock feed. Now, there's a lot more opportunity to get the information from these research outcomes to even very resource-poor farmers. This is a champion farmer at one of the project in one of the project watersheds. She won several awards. That's why she has a ribbon, and she was recognized by the I think at the Wareda level for her innovations in agriculture. She had one of the most diverse farms that I visited, and she had well under half a hectare, in which she was growing, I counted, some 15 different crops, most of which were irrigated now, but had not previously been irrigated. She was investing in ponds. She was investing in water diversion from the landscapes above her, so she was channeling water to where she needed it on her farm. And then she was also getting ready to invest in pumps because, again, to reduce the drudgery and expand the opportunities to cover more ground and increase productivity for more crops. We asked her about how it improved her food security, nutritional, her diet diversity, her income, and so on. And she said it was transformational, and by that she meant it really changed the way she lived her life and increased her aspiration to really do something with her farm beyond her own livelihood. She had several neighborhood children there essentially learning from her, and we asked them, do you plan on doing what your mentor is doing? And one young girl said, no, absolutely not. I want to go into agribusiness to supply her the inputs. So it was really quite transformational, even beyond her own farm. But, as Rob alluded to, managing water and expanding irrigation, diversifying irrigation systems is really key to what we all want at USAID, which is to, as someone recently put it, to put ourselves out of work. And I just can't imagine developing countries that rely heavily on development assistance graduating from that position without really improving water management and expanding the use of irrigation. And really this as Rob put it, this has a lot to do with resilience. We don't want to see achievements in 2 out of 10 years. We want to see reliable improvements, 9 out of 10 years. So we're really focused on risk reduction through these activities. One at the farm level, reducing production loss and failure, but also reducing the risk for the private sector to come in, provide reliable and effective inputs, including fertilizers, seeds, and even soil and water management practices. In the case of Ethiopia especially, but I think it's true elsewhere, a real goal of this project was to reduce the risk for the Ethiopian government to invest in these watershed scale improvement programs by making their investment dollars more effective in terms of the overall effect on the landscape, but also just really improving the productivity and economic outcomes for the smallholders there. So risk reduction kind of across the board, making it much easier to expand and diversify in these systems. So with that, I'll close and say just once again, thanks a lot to Neville, his leadership on the Innovation Lab, and you being engaged and hosting events like this. Thank you very much.